Okay, cool. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us once again. This is our second free webinar workshop. The last one went surprisingly well. Was our first workshop. For those who don't know us, we are Guerilla House. I'm Imran Samuels, and that's my business partner, Josh. He's going to be the one hosting this workshop. We're leading this workshop. And obviously, in light of the coronavirus pandemic, we've had to pivot and go digital. So this is kind of the start of us trying to take our educational offerings digital. So thank you to everyone for joining us, for giving us some of your time. We really appreciate it. Really appreciate the support. And also major thanks to everyone who donated to the event as well. We really appreciate it. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Josh. Oh, sorry, one more thing.
Yes.
Yeah, if you guys need anything, I'll be managing the chat room. So if there's any issues, any questions, anything like that, just drop it in the chat and I'll be sure to flag it for Josh.
Cool. Okay. Just checking that you can hear me all good. Thumbs up. Or response, I can't see your audio now. I mean your video. Okay, cool. Everyone can hear me. Okay. So afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending our second online workshop. Our first one ended a bit early. We tried out the free subscription from Zoom, and we realized, yeah, we definitely want longer duration workshops. So this workshop should be about an hour, give or take, and hopefully we have some time afterwards for a bit of questions and answers as well. Cool. So just a bit about who we are as Guerilla House. We've been going for almost 5 years now. Imran, as you saw earlier, and myself started the company, and we started off by doing very kind of low-tech, sustainably based, permaculture-based workshops. And as Imran has said, in light with everything that's going on, we've kind of had to move our workshops, which we normally host for about 30 people at a time, and we had to move that all online. So yeah, very excited to be doing the second workshop where we're going to be focusing a bit on fermented beverages. Still sticking with the theme of boosting the immune system, boosting the gut flora, and just making sure that you are taking in a diversity of fermentation. These fermentation workshops are also focused around using ingredients that are very locally and easily accessible. So things that are either in your home pantry or very close to you at the shop. We also try and kind of give you guys the blueprint of these fermentations, and then it's up to you to experiment with the flavors and the variations and the tastes and all of that. So we encourage you guys at the end of this to experiment as much as possible. And if you are going to experiment, please take photos and tag us on Instagram at Guerilla House or on Facebook, and just show us what you are doing. We are also trying to create a bit more of a social profile online as well. So we would really love if you guys could show us what you are doing with these fermentations. Cool. So I think people will join in as we go, but we're going to get started. And I think Imran is recording this, so this will go live, or this will go on YouTube within the next couple of days. So if you do not have all the necessary ingredients with you right now, you will be getting a recipe with everything included. But our main kind of focus for these workshops and for what we are doing is always to build community. And a big part of these workshops as well is just to show you all the economic value of these fermentations, how easy they are to make. Cool, let's get started. So what we're doing today is we're going to be making 3 fermented beverages. We're going to be making a Beet Kvass, which is more like a soda or tonic. We'll be making a ginger beer, and we will be making apple cider vinegar. Cool. So what is fermentation? Some of you might have joined us for our first workshop, but just to recap on what that term fermentation means. The word is very broadly used and has many definitions, and I'm not going to go too far down the rabbit hole on that one. But for me, very simply, the word means the transformative action of microorganisms. where they're busy consuming the sugars which are present in fruits, vegetables, grains, and they consume those sugars, and their byproduct includes things like CO2 or gases, which makes things fizzy and bubbly. Alcohol is another byproduct, or ethanol, and then acid, which can consume of things like acetic vinegar, lactic acid as well, which are also byproducts from different microorganisms. So very simply, microorganisms are transforming this food source and pre-digesting it, and what we are left with is this kind of magic concoction of pre-digest foods that we can then consume and use to activate our gut health and boost our immune system. Cool. So before we get started, just a bit of the kind of equipment that you're going to be needing, rough equipment. Mason jars or glass jars are great. They have sealable lids. Something else that's really nice to work with is measuring jugs as well, different measuring spoons, and then the different ingredients that we're going to be using today. In terms of hygiene and keeping things sterile, always make sure that you wash everything and clean everything before that you start to work with fermentations, just to make sure that the microorganisms that are entering once you have started the fermentation are the most beneficial microorganisms for the fermentation. So hygiene is important. Make sure you are washing your hands before you start any fermentation. I normally boil it and then wash it with a bit of dishwashing liquid. You can do a bleach dilution if you want, but just making sure that everything that you're working with is clean. Cool. Okay, so our first recipe that we're going to be starting off with today is something called Beet Kvass. Beet Kvass, here's some Beet Kvass and Beet Kvass. So Beet Kvass is a very, very old fermentation that stems in Ukraine and Russia. It's been recorded in usage or in history for as long as 2,000 years ago, and it's still a very popular tonic and drink that is drunk in Ukrainian and Russian households. It's become quite popular, and you're starting to see it at a lot more house stalls. It is a fermentation where the beetroot is fermented with lactic acid bacteria, and so it's a lactic acid fermentation that has quite a bit of bubble or fizz to it. Very simply, to make it, all you're going to need is some chopped up beetroot over here. You're going to need salt. In terms of salt, I try and use a salt that is unbleached and non-iodinized, which includes salts like Himalayan salt, sea salt, Kalahari salt. You get black salt as well. Basically, any salt that is not going to stop the growth of the microorganisms. So a lot of kosher salt as well, very good. Also salt that is very coarsely ground or grinded up, just so that it dissolves a bit better. That being said, I have used salt, very commercialized salts that have been a bit more bleached and iodinized, and it still works 100%. So in terms of the veggies and the salt you're using, if you can't get organic beetroots, that is fine. Just make sure that you are washing the beetroots. Over here, we've got 2 beetroots that I've chopped up into small blocks. I'm going to be using 2 tablespoons of salt and a chlorine-free water. In terms of the water that you're using, you can use normal tap water. It is full of chlorine, which can stop the growth of microorganisms. If you want to reduce the amount of chlorine in tap water, you can boil it and then let it cool down to room temperature, or you can let it sit overnight and kind of let the chlorine gas off as well. You can also use spring water or any other water that you have available. Okay, so let's get started. So what we're going to be making it in is a 350 ml glass jar. You can make it in any size you want and use the kind of this recipe and just multiply it. You're going to make it into a liter size glass jar, 1,000 ml glass jar, 3 liters if you want. So yeah, go crazy with this. There isn't a limit to what size you can use. I'm just using a small jar because it's what I have available. And it's always good to start off small and simply with these recipes just so that you get a better grip and then you can start expanding. Okay.
Josh,
So
can I jump in there quickly?
Yes,
There's a question, do you have to peel the beetroots beforehand?
No, preferably not. On the skin of the beetroot, you kind of want that unpeeled because it's full of yeast and beneficial bacteria that we want as a part of the fermentation process. It's full of lactic acid bacteria, so it's very important to keep the skin on. It just helps us kickstart that process.
Cool shot, man.
Cool. So we're going to fill the jar to about halfway or 3/4. Trying not to mess. Okay. There we go. Just press it a bit down. Okay. I'm then going to add 1 tablespoon of salt. I normally use about a tablespoon per 350 mils. And I've used about 1.5 beetroots inside here. In terms of salt, that's also up to you to play around with. Once the Beet Kvass has been fermenting for a couple of days, you can taste it. If it's too salty, you know next time to reduce the amount of salt as well. What the salt essentially is doing is just creating a stable pH and stable environment for the beneficial microbes like the lactic acid microbes to be able to grow and colonize this food source. Another reason beetroot is very good is one of the vegetables with the highest amount of sugars as well. So the sugars are also going to feed the microorganisms. Okay, so once we've added the salt and beetroot, we're then going to fill it up with the water, making sure that the water is properly covering every part of the beetroot. You don't want any part of the beetroot to be exposed. That's going to be in contact with oxygen. It's going to oxidize, and molds and other non-beneficial bacteria are going to grow, and that's not what we want. By submerging everything under this brine, you are ensuring that it's a stable pH, it's a very safe pH, and you won't get the growth of any molds. If molds are going to grow on here, you can scrape it off, just making sure that it hasn't contaminated the whole part of the fermentation. In the Q&A, we will also cover molds and harmful bacteria and how to identify that as well. Next step, what you can do is just shake it around to make sure that the salts are fully dissolved. You can dissolve the salt in a brine solution before. A kind of rough guide for fermenting vegetables with salt is the weight of the vegetables that you're going to be using in the fermentation. 2% of that weight is going to be the amount of salt you're going to be using. So you weigh how much the vegetables is going to be. 2% of that is salt. You then can add that 2% straight in and do what I'm doing, just shaking it to make sure it's dissolved. Or you can add that to the appropriate amount of water and then fill that into the jar. Perfect. I'm looking around to make sure that it's fully dissolved. I'm just making sure that everything is fully submerged. I'm making sure that there's a bit of headroom so that when there's a bit of gases that are going to be let off from the microorganisms, just to give it a bit of space for expansion as well. It's not an extremely carbonated fermentation, but that being said, it's a good rule for fermentation to make sure that you have a bit of space when it comes to off-gassing and carbonation, just so that things don't explode. Another thing you can do is every day or every 2 days, you can come back and slowly just open it up to off-gas it. You'll hear gas being released, the carbon dioxide, which is a metabolic process from the microorganisms, and then you can close it again. In about 3 days, what you're going to notice is bubbles growing on the top, which means that it's active. the lactobacilli is busy breaking down the sugars and the pectin in the beetroot, and are exuding lactic acid and gases, right? So after 3 days, you'll see some bubbles. You can open it up. You can then strain it off if you want to. And then you can then serve it or put it in the fridge. If it is still not salty enough or you want it a bit more sour, you can leave it for about a week and then strain it off. Preferably use a cheesecloth like this, or a cheesecloth you can get at a lot of fabric stores. You can use a tea towel as well. You can use a plastic strainer, or you can even use a metal strainer. I do try and stay away from metal when I'm fermenting because of the acidity, and the microbes can corrode some of the metal, and you do not want heavy metals in any of these fermentations. Okay, so once your kvass has finished fermenting and you strain it out, you can then dilute it with water. If you want to, you can drink it as is. It's quite a powerful fermentation. It can get quite sour. So I prefer to dilute it and add a bit of ice and lemon and a bit of mint. I normally start with about a quarter cup of drinking this per day because it is quite strong in the digestive system. Kvass is very, very good for the liver, for the kidneys, very good for helping the digestive system, very good as a blood tonic. It's very high in magnesium as well, so very good for the bones. And it's very high in vitamin C, so very good for the immune system and fighting off any colds and flu, anything like that. So it's a great handy tool to have in terms of fighting off any infections. It's a very easy fermentation. It needs just 3 ingredients: water, beetroot, and salt. And then it's up to you to play around with how long you allow the fermentation to take place. So in terms of how you flavor it, you can add a whole bunch of different spices and herbs as well to add a bit of flavor and zest to it. You can add orange to it. I've made a beautiful orange and beetroot kvass before. You can replace the beetroot and put in ginger and carrots if you want to, and use the same process. You can put in a bit of rosemary as well and use it as a salad dressing. Or you can even take it one step further if you want, and you can strain it off. You can then add it into, I don't have any pop bottles at the moment, but you can add it to a glass bottle that allows for a bit of carbonation. You can then add, for every liter of kvass, I add about 1 tablespoon of sugar. I then also normally add a fruit that is full of sugars, like apples, pears, something like that. And then I close that up and I allow for the carbonation to take place. What is then happening is the gas that is coming off from the microorganisms consuming the sugar, they're releasing a lot of gas. That gas is building up, carbonating it. It won't build to a hectic carbonation, but when you then open it, it then releases a bit of gases, and then it builds a bit of kind of fizz to it as well, which makes for delicious, delicious kind of soda, which you can add a bit of ice to as well. Very, very, very simple fermentation to do. Yeah, I mean, the most traditional of your kvasses is actually used, instead of beetroot, they used stale bread, stale rye bread, and that was used as your starter. The rye bread was full of yeast, and the yeast kind of got the fermentation to get going. So play around with the fermentation. I normally allow it to ferment for about 4 days, and I normally make it in about 1 liter glass jars. Yeah, and that's the very basic principles of Beet Kvass. Cool.
Joshi, can I jump
when
in?
we come to the Q&A, sure, you can.
Sorry, man. Yeah, I didn't know it was so simple. Just 3 questions on my side. Just the amount of salt, it's 1 tablespoon for that 350 mils, eh?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And then Alina's asking, why is the process so different from making sauerkraut? Like the mixing part.
Maybe extrapolate a bit more on that.
I'm assuming it's because you didn't have to massage the beet like you would with the cabbage. Um,
Yes,
okay, so that's
yes.
that's the
So
difference.
yes, the only difference, I mean, essentially what you are doing is you are brining beetroot in a salt brine, very similar to sauerkraut. They all fall under the same type of fermentation called your lactic acid fermentations or your lacto-veg fermentation. This is just a bit of a variation on sauerkraut, and essentially sauerkraut juice and beet kvass actually taste very similar and are both jam-packed with microorganisms and goodness for your body. Cool.
Oh,
Was there a third question?
yeah, that was my last question. Like, what does it taste like?
Okay, so it's got quite a sour taste to it. It tastes quite a bit like sauerkraut, if I can describe it like that. But remember, beets or beetroots are full of sugars, so it's got a bit of an aftertaste of sweetness to it as well. So I find it's got a balance between sweet and sour. Yeah, it's quite an unusual tonic to drink.
Cool. Thanks, man.
Cool. Is that it on questions for
Yeah,
Beet Kvass?
that's it for now.
Okay, cool. If you guys do have more questions, we will cover some questions in the Q&A. And then also we will be available on WhatsApp or email us as well if you guys do have pressing questions afterwards. Okay, so as easy as that. And then just in terms of storage, so what I want to do is just make sure that I keep it in a dark spot in the kitchen or pantry away from direct sunlight, which can destroy some of the microorganisms. And then I'm letting it sit from 3 to 7 days. And then after that, I'm straining it off and drinking it and then playing around with the flavors. Okay, so after you've made some beet kvass, something else that you can make that's very simple and very easy is apple cider vinegar. It's one of my favorite fermentations to make because of how easy it is. Also because when you want to buy organic apple cider vinegar at the stores, it's quite expensive, and making it is just ridiculously easy. Okay, so over here we've got about, I would say this jar is about a 3.5 liter jar. It's a very big glass jar. I normally make apple cider vinegar in these 3 liter jars so that I make sure that I do have some apple cider vinegar for a while. That being said, we are going to be making it in the smaller guy over here. And then what you can do is, depending on what size jar you have, what size container you have, you can just then expand on the recipe. Okay, so what you're going to want is chopped up apples. Wait for the light to adjust. I chop it up with just small enough blocks to fit into the jar. You don't need to grate it up too finely. I know a lot of people do like a finely grated apple, but I've always had perfect success with apples grated this much. So what I'm going to do is fill it up as well to about halfway. Instead of salt, though, we're going to be using sugar for this fermentation. Like to make sure it's quite nicely pressed down so the apples don't come up and touch oxygen. Okay, so a bit more than bit more than half. So let's just say about 3/4 of the way. Okay. Next thing I like to do is add salt. So for every apple that I use about 1 tablespoon of salt. I've only used about 1.5 apples over here. So I'm going to use about 1.5 tablespoons of, sugar. And use about 1.5 tablespoons of sugar. Don't worry about the amount of sugar you're using. So what is essentially happening is the yeast that are part or one of the main parts of this fermentation, the yeast are going to be breaking down the sugars in the apple and the sugar that you are adding. They are breaking that down, and part of the first fermentation is they are, as a byproduct, releasing CO2, where you'll see the bubbles, the gas, and then ethanol or alcohol. So after the first part of this fermentation, it first turns into an ethanol or alcohol, essentially apple cider. And then after that, once those sugars start running out and those yeasts can't metabolize the sugars anymore, you get a new family of bacteria and microorganisms that come in and convert the ethanol or alcohol into acetic acid or a vinegar, right? Those types of bacteria are called acetic acid forming bacteria. And what they are doing is just the second fermentation, converting the ethanol into a vinegar. Most of your alcohols, beer, wine, ciders, mead, if left for long enough and exposure to any oxygen, it will oxidize and it will turn into a vinegar. A lot of wine, cider, beer makers will add a type of stabilizer into their fermentation so that it does not become a vinegar once it is done with the alcohol process of the fermentation. We're not adding any stabilizers, so after it becomes a cider, it then starts to become a vinegar. Okay, so what we're going to do now is add our sugar. In terms of what you can use any sugar source, so coconut blossom sugar, white sugar, brown sugar. You can use honey if you want to. Honey is quite great because it has a lot of yeast and microorganisms already present. Honey just normally takes a bit slow and a bit longer in terms of a fermentation time. Also very important when you are fermenting anything. What is very important is, number one, how long you are leaving it. So that will give you your end product, how vinaigrette is, how sour it is, how fermented it is. And one of the other main factors is the temperature. In summer, things are going to ferment quicker, and in winter, things are going to ferment slower. Slower temperature means a slower metabolic process from the microorganisms, which means a slower transformative action of the food source. Okay, so we're adding 1 tablespoon of sugar. I like to make sure that I shake it around so that it's fully covered. Okay. And then add or fill it. You want to always make sure that the apples are fully submerged. A lot of the time what happens is, as you can see, not all the apples are fully submerged, as the apples want to automatically rise up. So there's a couple solutions you can do for that in terms of fermentations when something is rising above the kind of brine or a sugary solution that you want to keep it under. So you can fill number one is you can fill a Ziploc bag with some water and push it down so that it keeps everything submerged under the water. You can use a smaller lid that's going to fit around the edge of this glass jar, sort of fit inside and keep all the apples down. I've seen people clean rocks and put a rock down. As long as you're making sure that the apples are fully submerged under that sugary water. What I normally do is I will put a lid onto that. Okay, I'm going to first make sure that the sugar is fully dissolved. And then I'm just going to make sure that every day I come and I'm just turning it and making sure that everything, all the apples are changing and that not the same apple pieces are oxidizing or coming into contact with oxygen. What you will start to see over time is a film or a SCOBY grow on the top layer of this fermentation, and that is just kind of making sure that everything is kept under that, kept safe and not coming into contact with oxygen. So just make sure that you're either adding a weight or that you're coming daily just to shake everything around so that no molds or harmful bacteria are created. So once
Josh,
your sugar is fully, yes.
Sorry, man. Do you have a SCOBY there in the jar that you can show us?
In the big jar?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. I don't know if you guys heard that. There's release of gases.
Okay. Even just the jar up close, that's cool.
Okay, so this top level over here, it's about this thick. That's the apple cider vinegar SCOBY that has formed onto this one. And what is great is, because I'm making so much apple cider vinegar all the time, the microorganisms and yeast are floating around, and it is coming to this new source of apple cider vinegar over here, and will be inoculating it, so this will automatically grow a SCOBY around it over here. If a SCOBY does not grow around it, it's not the end of the world. The fermentation process is still taking place. How you can tell if it is fermenting. Number one, you will see that this watery, sugary solution will start to become murkier and murkier. The apple walls, the pectin, is busy breaking down. The sugars are busy breaking down. Number two, you will start to see some bubbles forming on the top layer over here, which means gases are being released. Another thing that you can do, this is an aerobic fermentation. So you want to make sure that the glass jar is not 100% sealed. What I normally do, if I do not have a cheesecloth to put onto it, I'm going to show you guys what a cheesecloth is right now. So cheesecloth is just a finely porous material. I don't think you guys can see all the grains. Finely porous material. You can use a tea towel. You can even use an old t-shirt. Anything that isn't going to allow fruit flies or any other insects to come into your fermentation. So this needs to make contact with oxygen. The yeast need to be able to come and inoculate this food source over here. So what I'm going to do is add the cheesecloth on top. Okay, very simple. And I'm going to let that sit and ferment for about 3 to 4 weeks, which is the first fermentation process, right? Once the yeast and the microorganisms start to consume the sugar and start to produce alcohol and different gases, once they are finished with the alcohol process after about 3 to 4 weeks, I then let it sit for longer. What you can do after 3 to 4 weeks is when you smell it, you will actually smell a bit of hints of a kind of alcohol fermentation, and you also smell hints of vinegar. After the 3 to 4 weeks, you can either strain off the apples if you want to, and then let it sit another 4 more weeks to produce acetic acid or vinegar, or you can leave the apples inside there if there is no mold growing, and you can then allow it to then transform into the second fermentation and allow it to become an acetic acid. If you do not have a cheesecloth present, you can also put the lid very loosely onto your fermentation to allow for gaseous exchange, to allow for your yeast and microorganisms to enter and exit, but it's stopping fruit flies from going inside. I've done a lot of my fermentations without using cheesecloth. Even this big thing of apple cider vinegar, I just kept it on very loosely, which then allowed the fermentation process to take place. After about the second 4 weeks, so 7 to 8 weeks, you will really start smelling the vinegar from this process. Once you are happy with and I do encourage you to take a teaspoon or tablespoon every week or 2 weeks to actually taste the process and taste how it transforms from the different acidity levels as well to the quite strong pungent vinegar, right? If you want a bit of a sweeter vinegar, then you just stop the fermentation a bit earlier. To stop the fermentation, what you are doing, if you haven't strained the apples out then, is you're going to strain out the rest of the apples. If you've already strained out the apples, what you're going to do is put a lid onto this fermentation or strain it into a vinegar bottle, anything else that you want to bottle it into. And then you can put a lid onto that nice and tightly sealed, which kind of stops the fermentation. Vinegar will also ferment to a certain point and then not ferment anymore because there's no more food source. But what's great about a vinegar fermentation, or what's great about making vinegar, is that vinegar is a really good preservative. It lasts for a very long time. In terms of microbiotic activity in vinegar, there isn't many microorganisms in vinegar because it's a very, very high pH or very high acidity level for the microorganisms to live within. So it isn't fully jam-packed with microorganisms, but what's great about it is very good as a preservative. It is very good for your digestive system. It's very good as an alkalizer. We use apple cider vinegar as a cleaning agent, diluted with a bit of water, or you can add some lemon and orange peel to it. You can also infuse your vinegar. So for example, I've got a vinegar over here that I've strained off, right? And then what I'm going to do now is I want to enhance the flavor of this vinegar a bit more. So all I'm going to do is add some herbs to this vinegar over here. I'm using what herbs I've got in the garden. And all I'm using is a bit of summer savory, which tastes like rosemary and thyme. And then I'm using a bit of confetti bush, which is an indigenous plant, which has quite a aromatic scent to it, and I quite love it in teas. So you don't have to crush it up, just making sure that it can fit into here. I put my herb in, I put my lid onto it, and all I'm going to do is just turn that and let it sit for about a month. I'm then going to take the herb out of it, and I've got a summer savory and confetti bush infused apple cider vinegar. So there's a lot of things you can do with vinegar in the end process of it. You don't essentially have to use apples to make the vinegar, or a specific type of apples. You can use pears as well. Pear vinegar is really delicious. So essentially all you have to remember is that it's a two-stage fermentation. Stage one is when ethanol alcohol is produced from the active yeast, and stage two's acetic acid is produced, which is then your vinegar. Cool. Very, very easy to make vinegar. I normally use a 3-liter jar to make it, but please try and use whatever you have available. Also, I mean, if you don't have glass that is available, plastic is fine to use. It's not the best thing to use because vinegar is a solvent, so it can pull and strip out the harmful properties of plastic. But if you have a crock pot or anything like that, that also works, in ceramicware also works. But if you can get glass, use glass. We have a supplier for glass named Barnpack. I think once the lockdown kind of ends or regulations are eased a bit, make your way to Barnpack, and they have probably the cheapest and biggest selection of different glassware for fermentation. Okay, so any other questions you guys have, we'll cover in the Q&A, but vinegar is that simple to make, or apple cider vinegar is that simple to make. And when you work out the costs, all we used was, even when I'm making something like 3 liters, I only use about 6 apples, use about 2.5 to 3 liters of water, and I use about half a cup to 3/4 cup sugar. So for about 2.5 liters of apple cider vinegar, it cost me 30 Rand to make, excluding the amount I spent on the glass jar. And then you have infinite amount of apple cider vinegar. Share it, give it to your friends, your neighbors. Very easy fermentation. Cool. Okay, so that's apple cider vinegar. Yes.
Sorry, Joshi. Just a specific question regarding this from, I think it's Bruno Alves. Does exposing the infusion to sunlight help or hinder the process?
With most of these, it will hinder the process. You don't want to expose these to sunlight. The sunlight can destroy a lot of the active microorganisms that are breaking down the sugars. So I try and leave it somewhere that doesn't have direct sunlight. So in terms of taste and all of that, you can also drink this apple cider vinegar after 4 or 5 weeks of use. It's going to be quite sweet and taste quite a bit like a cider. and will probably have some sort of alcohol content to it. Not sure they're on the exact percentage, but it's up to you guys to experiment on the flavor as well. Cool. Any other questions, Imran?
No, I think that's it for now. Thanks, man.
Okay, cool. And now the last process and the newest one that we've started experimenting with is ginger beer. Ginger beer is a very, very easy process to make. For this, you do not need a starter. Once again, I am going to explain a bit about at the end of this, because for some of these fermentations, you can add something called whey or a starter just to kind of kickstart the process. But we're not going to need that for any of these. We are trying to teach you guys how to start your own starters, or how to kickstart your own fermentations using your local environment and the local microorganisms that are presently active and all over our fruit and veggies at the moment. Okay, so the next thing we are busy making is ginger beer. I unfortunately do not have fancy pop glass bottles because I haven't been able to get to bond pack, so I've had to use a normal plastic soda bottle to bottle up my ginger, or my second fermentation of my ginger. But that being said, it still built up quite a bit of fizz, which I'll show you guys now. So what you are doing when you are making ginger beer, firstly, is you want to start something called the ginger bug or the ginger starter. And what you are basically doing is just creating happy, healthy colonies of yeast and beneficial microorganisms that are going to be able to inoculate your end source of ginger beer to allow for that carbonation and to allow for the beneficial microorganisms to dominate that food source. So it's a three-part ingredient fermentation recipe again. All you are needing is sugar, water, and grated ginger. What's great about ginger and why it's used in a lot of fermentations is the skin of ginger is full of yeast colonies that are really beneficial and really, really important as a part of this process of making ginger beer. So do not peel the ginger. Make sure that it has a skin on it. And then that just ensures that the fermentation is going to become very active. So what I do is I firstly grate the ginger, if you guys can see that, until it's quite fine. So I've grated the ginger. All I'm going to do is add it into a glass jar. For the ginger bug, you do not need a large amount. For about 1 liter of ginger beer, you only need about a quarter cup of the ginger bug starter. So that's why you can play around with small amounts with the ginger bug starter and then use that to inoculate your main source of the ginger beer. Okay, so what we're going to do is get a tablespoon. We're going to add in 2 tablespoons heat of the grated ginger. I'm making sure that I get lots of the skin, which has lots of yeast on it. The yeast will then convert the sugars. So 2 tablespoons of that. I then need 2 tablespoons of sugar. I normally do about a 1-to-1 ratio of grated ginger and sugar. With a lot of these fermentations using sugar, don't be worried about the high sugar content. You can allow the fermentation process to go as long as you want to thus lessen the amount of sugar in your end fermentation. Some people prefer a bit of a sweeter fermentation. Some people prefer a bit of a more sour, vinegary fermentation, thus allowing it to ferment for longer and thus allowing it to consume more sugar. Okay.
Josh,
So,
sorry, man.
yes.
Question regarding white or brown sugar. Are they equally as effective? Should you steer towards one, or what's the...
I like the brown sugar just purely on the taste. It produces a bit darker, the ginger beer, and I prefer the taste a bit better, where the white sugar has been said to activate the fermentation a bit quicker because it's a bit more processed, so the microorganisms can break it down a bit quicker. But I try and stay away from as processed of a sugar as possible. So I try and stick with brown sugar. With that being said, any sugars once again will work. So if you do not have sugar, you can use honey, you can use coconut blossom sugar. Any sugar content will work for this one, but I'm using a brown sugar for this.
Okay. And I'm also
Cool.
assuming that the brown sugar obviously has molasses, which means there's a bit more of a mineral content in there as well.
Yes, yeah, that's very important. It's got a bit more minerals, and it's got the brown essentials. It's got a bit more iron as well to the sugar as well, so a bit more minerals into your body.
Okay, and then brother Sean's asking how much sugar again for this study.
Okay, so it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So I've added 2 tablespoons of ginger. I'll then put in 2 tablespoons of sugar.
Okay, cool. Thanks, man.
Okay, cool. And then what I'm going to do is use about 100 to 150 mils of water. Okay. This isn't very, very strict over here because we're going to be feeding this fermentation more and more and more. So then you'll actively start seeing the bubbles and the gases metabolize the sugars. So I normally will start off with about half a jar, and then you tip a bit out, and then you'll add a bit more sugar and a bit more ginger every day to feed the yeast. So once I've added the sugar and the ginger, I'm just going to make sure that it is fully dissolved. So I am stirring it. Okay, so I've got maybe about 150, 200 mils of the starter or the ginger bug right here. And so what I'm going to do is then put on the cheesecloth, or loosely put on a lid. Put the cheesecloth on, just getting elastic. Okay, I'm going to leave that for 24 hours. Then I'm going to come back to it in 24 hours and add another tablespoon of ginger and another tablespoon of sugar. Make sure that is fully dissolved. I'm then going to leave it for another 24 hours. And I'm going to carry on with that process for about anything from 3 to 5 days until you start seeing a lot of bubbles forming on this top surface over here. Okay? Once you start seeing a lot of bubbles forming on the top surface over here, the yeast, you know the yeast are active, you know the microorganisms are active, and they're busy breaking down the sugars. As soon as you see that happening, you can then start to use this as your ginger bug as a part of your main fermentation. Okay, so after now 3 to 4 days, I'm busy checking on this, and I see, okay, there's a lot of bubbles forming on top here. I can smell it. You can smell that it's starting to ferment. You can smell that the sweetness is starting to go away, and that a bit more of an alcoholic, vinegary smell is starting to come out from this, right? So once I'm happy with that, and the only way you can tell if it's really active is by the gas and by the bubbles forming on the top, okay? So once I'm very happy, what I'm then going to do is strain it off, and then I'm going to add it to the main source of ginger beer. So over here, which we will send you guys the recipe to, what I've done is, now this is the second part of the ginger beer, or actually making the main part of the ginger beer. So just to cover quickly, I've got my starter, which is this one here. It's been about 5 days, so I'm happy with the growth. I can see the yeast are active, and now I want to make the actual ginger beer. What I then do is I will boil 3.5 cups of water. I will boil that with about 5 to 6 grated tablespoons of ginger and about 4 tablespoons of sugar, 4 to 5 tablespoons of sugar. I will add that all into a pot of boiling water, 3.5 cups of boiling water. I'll add the ginger and the sugar all together. I'll let that sit. I'll let that cool to room temperature. Once it has cooled to room temperature, I will then add in the ginger bug, right? I make sure that when I add in the ginger bug, it is fully strained and that I do not add in these pieces of ginger. And I'll add then about 1/4 cup of the ginger bug to this main source of ginger beer. So as you guys know, this obviously hasn't fully fermented. It's been now, what, 5 minutes? But let's say it has fully fermented. I can then strain it. Just use a bit of this. I'll strain this. Starter, 1/4 cup. In with the ginger beer solution. Okay. I will then stir that to make sure that the ginger bug will fully inoculate this ginger beer. Okay. I have seen a lot of ginger beer recipes where they keep the ginger in with the sugars, but you don't have to do that. You can also keep the gingers in with the sugars as well to just make sure that there are a lot of yeast colonies present, but it isn't 100% needed. So once I've added the starter to this ginger beer, you can do 2 things from here. I can then, if I want to, add the cheesecloth and let it ferment for about another 24 hours to fully ensure that the starter is going to colonize this new food source of ginger, water, and sugar. Or, because I've mixed it around quite a bit, I can find my bottle. I can bottle it up straight away. You do want to preferably use a glass pop bottle that is used specifically for carbonated drinks. You do want to make sure that it is a fermentation grade bottle. You do not want to use an ornamental bottle because when it comes to carbonating fermentations, the carbonation can build up quite intensively and actually cause a bottle to explode, which has happened on more than one occasion. So first 2 things you are doing is, number 1, you are making sure that there's quite a bit of headspace to allow for expansion and to allow for the carbonation to take place, for the gases to be released by the microorganisms. And the second thing you want to make sure is that it is airtight. Okay. I will then allow this to sit and start fermenting for anything from 4 days to a week, if not a bit longer. You will start to feel the bottle to start hardening because of the gases being released, which means the fermentation is taking place. And you will start to feel the carbonation building up from the fermentation. What you do want to make sure is that if you do not have any type of airlock, you want to just off-gas it. Off-gassing it, as explained earlier, is just releasing a bit of the gas every day or every second day, just to make sure that there isn't too much of a buildup of carbonation. After about 4 days to a week, depending on how carbonated you want it and how fermented you want it, you can then put it in the fridge and store it, and it will then last in the fridge in terms of storage for about 2 weeks to a month, give or take. the main part of this fermentation was the ginger bug, right? So you always want to make sure there's a bit of ginger bug left behind to kickstart the next process. If you are finished making ginger beer, you can put your ginger bug into the fridge, right? This is your new starter. You can put it in the fridge, and then you can feed it a tablespoon of sugar and a tablespoon of vinegar once a week, just to make sure that the microorganisms are still fed and kept healthy. And then when you want to use this ginger bug again, you can take it out the fridge, let it warm up to room temperature, make your solution again with ginger water and sugar, and then add your ginger bug and then let it ferment for that second fermentation process. Cool, as easy as that. And essentially, I mean, you are using ginger, but when it comes to a lot of these carbonated beverages, you are following a very simple process. Process one is you're introducing the microorganisms by either the food source. So on a lot of our fruit, like a lot of our fruits are veg and spices and herbs, the microorganisms are already present on them. Ginger already has a lot of yeast colonies on them. Beetroot and cabbage have a lot of lactic acid bacteria on them. Apples have a lot of yeast on them. So you are then adding the sugar, which is their food source. So once you feed the microbes their food source, which comes from the sugars in the vegetables and fruits, or the sugars you add from honey or normal sugar, they then metabolize that, and then you are either end with an alcoholic substance or ethanol substance. You end up with something that is full of lactic acids, or you end up with something that is full of the gases or the carbonation. So in terms of the recipes we've given you over here, you can follow the strict kind of ratios and recipes, but as long as you're following the guidelines of feeding these microorganisms sugars and allowing the fermentation to take place, you can ferment a lot more than just apples and ginger and beetroot. You can kind of ferment any vegetable or any fruit, and then depending on how long you allow it to ferment will also then depend on what your end product is from the fermentation. So we have some ginger beer that's been sitting for about 4 days now. I can feel it is quite carbonated. You can see a bit of bubbles forming on the top over there. I don't think it's going to be heavily carbonated. Let's hear, you might hear there was a bit of a gas release and some bubbles released. And so if I realize this isn't carbonated enough, I can then let it sit for a couple more days and off-gas it less. If I'm happy with this carbonation, I can then serve it with some ice. I can dilute it with a bit more water. Let's taste this one. That's really good. You can taste the bubbles from the carbonation. I can taste the rich aromas from the ginger. So yeah, that's really good. Very happy with that fermentation. In terms of flavoring as well, you can also, when you're doing your second ferment, so after you have made the ginger bug and you are making your ginger with boiling water and sugar, you can add chilies if you want to that, to make a bit of a chili ginger bug or a kind of chili tonic. You can add cloves. You can add a bit of cinnamon as well. You can even add a bit of apples, just to kind of change that ginger beer. A lot of people also traditionally add raisins or dates as well to give it a bit of sugar for that second fermentation. And it's as simple as that. Cool. So those are 3 fermentations we have focused on today: the Beet Kvass, the apple cider vinegar, and the ginger beer. We will be sending you guys the recipes later, but I always encourage you guys to experiment as much as possible. Play around with how much sugars you're using, how much salt you're using. Very, very, very important is my notebook, which is somewhere here. Here it is, on the table. keep a notebook. This has got all my recipes in it. It's got all my variations. When I taste something and it tastes too acidic or too sweet, then I then always building on my experience. So very important when you are sure to label your fermentation. Tape works well. You also buy labels. You can also get a kind of chalk marker or and write on your glass the ingredient to use, when you made it, in track of when you have made the fermentation. You know how storage and mold. Make sure that you are monitoring your fermentations. If a bit of mold or unwanted bacteria is growing onto your fermentation, have a look at it. If it is just on the top layer of the fermentation, you can actually scrape it off, because most of the other part of the fermentation should be quite stable, should have quite a high enough pH to kind of ward off the harmfulness of those molds. But if you are worried, you can throw it out and just start the fermentation process again if you want to. If you do see a white kind of mold growing on top, it's quite a thin membrane mold. It's actually called calm mold. That's completely fine. That's 100% healthy. Don't worry if that grows in your fermentation. You can just give your ferment a bit of a jiggle to mix it in, and perfect consume. Okay, so we will be sending through the recipes. So a part of our workshops, please, if you guys can give us any feedback or anything we might have missed as a part of this fermentation, fermented beverage kind of workshop, just that we're always growing on our fermentations as well. We are looking to get a bit better equipment once stores start opening. But yeah, we're very happy to push out this knowledge onto an online platform as well. Please review us as well on Google Review or on Facebook. If you are going to be making any of these ferments at home, please take photos and tag us in your stories. We'd love to see what you guys get up to as well. If you guys are playing around with any variations. I see a lot on social media at the moment. A lot of people are making fermented pineapple drink or a type of tapashi, which is also very, very easy to make, essentially using the processes that we have made today. And you are replacing the apple with the pineapple skin. You are essentially making this pineapple drink as well. So please play around, get experimental. Yeah, cool. So I think what we're going to do, I'm just going to check if I've covered anything. Okay, yeah. So storage, just want to just make sure. So most of these ferments, you can store and have a lifespan in the fridge for about 3 weeks to a month. The vinegar has the longest lifespan, and the lifespan is kind of indefinite. So yeah, once added to the fridge, if you are going to be making a vinegar, it has the longest lifespan. Make sure that you are off gassing it so that carbonation doesn't build up. You do get things called airlock devices, which you can build, very easy to build. There's a lot of DIY instructions on how to build it online, or you can buy airlock devices from home brewery stores or anything like that. An airlock device is basically just ensuring that the carbon dioxide or the gas is releasing. So it's got a kind of water bubble in it, allows the gas to release from that, but doesn't allow any gas or oxygen to enter back into the fermentation. And that's about it. And then just make sure that if you are going to be bottling anything that is going to be carbonated, so if it's going to be a second fermented Beet Kvass or a ginger beer or anything like that, make sure that you do get proper bottles that can hold the carbonation. Otherwise, it will pop, it will explode. Okay,
Josh,
so I think what we're going to do now is a bit of Q&A. Yes.
Yeah, can I grab some of the people's questions?
Please do.
Okay, so the first one that I saw earlier was, can you use molasses instead of sugar for the ginger beer?
Yes, yes, you can. I haven't used molasses before, but molasses is a byproduct from the sugar refinery process. molasses is very high in a sugar content. It should be perfectly fine to use. What you will probably end up with is a darker colored ginger beer, and probably hints of that molasses aroma to it as well. I'd actually be quite interested to see what a molasses ginger beer would taste like, but you can use molasses there.
Okay, cool. And then there was another one asking, do you know the alcohol content of the ginger beer?
No. So the alcohol, unless you have a type of alcohol refractor that is able to pick up how much sugar and yeast and all of that is active in your fermentation. In terms of the ginger beer, I would say anything from about 0.5 to even as high as 2%. If you are adding in a specific yeast that you use to make a cider or a mead or a beer, if you're adding that type of isolated yeast into your ginger beer process, you will probably be left with a more alcoholic ginger beer because that yeast will produce a higher content alcohol.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Thanks, man. Then there was another question. Washing the veggies and the apples as well. Would that not remove some of the microbes that we're looking to cultivate? So is it a good idea to wash them or no?
It's quite a topic because if you're washing it, you're removing some of the pesticides and all of that, which actually stop the growth of these microorganisms, or B, you're actually removing these microorganisms. I'm for washing because I'd rather remove some of the pesticides than be worried about removing the microorganisms. In truth be told, there are trillions and trillions of microorganisms and yeasts around on the food source. So I wouldn't be too worried about washing off the microorganisms unless you are washing off your fruits and veg with a bleach solution, which I do not agree with in the first place, and you shouldn't be washing your fruit and veg with bleach. So other than that, your microbes should be fine. I do recommend washing your veg first.
Okay, cool. I think that's it. If I missed anyone's questions, please drop it in the chat right now. I got kicked out about 5 minutes ago, so I lost most of the chat. But I think I've covered everyone's. And I'm sure we'll also be available via Facebook, email. So if you do have any burning questions, as Josh said, then just drop us a message.
Yes. I think our biggest thing with all our workshops we do at Guerilla House, and we're planning to bring quite a lot of online workshops out. Anything from, we're going to carry on with a whole bunch of different ferments. We're going to do some dairy ferments. I know Emo's working on some stuff to do in the garden as well. I'm also going to do some stuff on propagation. But with any of our workshops we do, anything that we are busy experimenting with, we always try and kind of push things to the limit in terms of what you can do and what you can't do. So even in terms of whoever asked about if you can use molasses and those type of things, as long as there's a sugar content, feel free to use it. Feel free to experiment. Just make sure that you start slow and simply. Make sure that you know what's going on with the fermentation process. Make sure that you can observe the bubbles that are active and the bubbles being released. And make sure that you taste it at the different stages as well, so that you know at what stage you want to stop the fermentation or take it over there.
Sorry, Joshy, there was one more question. Can you hear me? Hello,
hello.
Sorry, can you hear me? It was a bit choppy there. There was one last question from Neil. How long must the ginger bug start to ferment before adding to the big mix?
Okay, good question, Neil. Anything from 3 days to 5 days. You will notice as soon as you start to see a lot of bubbles forming on the top layer of the ginger bug, you will know that it is active. You will know that gases are being released, and you know that you have a healthy colonies of microorganisms that you can use to inoculate your main ginger beer or the second fermentation. So just to cut it short, as soon as you're seeing a lot of bubbles, you know I can use my ginger bug as a part of the process. If you do not start seeing bubbles after 3 to 5 days, it means that the process didn't kick start as you would have liked. And what I can recommend is you start again, maybe add a bit more ginger skin, maybe a bit more sugar, and just play around with that recipe. It could also be a bit colder. We're going into winter now. So instead of it being 5 days, maybe just see after 7 days if there is any activity. If there is an activity, I recommend starting again. That being said, I've done this now. Maybe I've made a ginger bug starter maybe about 15 times, and in all those 15 times, I've always been successful with the starter. Don't go to your store and go and buy yeast packets. With any of these fermentations, please don't go buy yeast packets unless you are wanting to produce something specific out of this fermentation, like a more alcohol high fermentation or something like that. Okay.
Okay, cool, man. Thanks so much. That seems like all the questions have been answered. Thanks so much for all the wisdom.
Yes. Okay.
And yeah, I'll leave it to you to sign off.
Okay, cool. Cool. It's our pleasure. And as we start doing more of these online workshops, we look to improve, firstly, the quality of the video. I'm sorry if the video hasn't been 100% perfect. Getting there, to improve the audio, and improve the content that we are getting out there. But I just really want to thank you, and we are very, very grateful for the support that we have received from only our second workshop. Thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you for being fully a part of this process. We are going to try and keep our workshops as kind of practical as possible, as participatory as possible, so that you guys are taking part of the processes as we are doing it live. Cool. So thank you once again. Really much appreciate and love you guys all, and see you guys for the next online workshop. Cool.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks so much.